The air at Nellis was thick with the scent of jet fuel and ego. It was the kickoff for Operation Cerberus, a multinational aerial combat exercise that brought together the best of the best, or, at least, that's what the brochure said. For Lieutenant Commander Jocks Ripperthorne, it meant a chance to solidify his reputation as the Navy's next great ace. He and his squadron, the VFA 103 Jolly Rogers, were the tip of the spear, flying the newest Block 3 Super Hornets, gleaming in the desert sun. They were young, sharp, and knew they were the stars of the show. And then there was her, Major Kaylin Rostova. She was an Air Force exchange pilot, assigned to their squadron for the duration of the exercise. She was older than the rest of them, by at least a decade, with faint lines around her eyes that spoke more of fatigue than laughter. Her movements were economical, her voice quiet, her presence utterly unremarkable. She flew one of the older F-15C Eagles, a relic by their standards, and carried herself like a librarian who'd wandered onto the flight line by mistake. The whispers started on day one. Desk jockey, someone muttered in the briefing room, probably spent the last 15 years flying a PowerPoint. Ripper didn't discourage it. Competence, in his world, was loud. It was aggressive. It wasn't quiet. What truly baffled them, however, was the patch on her right shoulder. It wasn't a standard issue unit patch. It was a simple black circle, stitched with a single, stylized feather of burnished silver. No text, no numbers, no other symbols. It was stark, elegant, and completely alien. None of the patch collectors in the squadron recognized it. When a cocky lieutenant had asked her about it, she'd simply replied, "It's from a previous assignment," her voice flat, offering no invitation for follow-up. They took it as another sign of her REMF status, a vanity patch from some forgotten logistics wing. The first hop of the exercise was a simple defensive counter-air patrol. For Birds Up, Ripper leading, his wingman, and Kaylin with a rookie. Call sign Echo, tucked in on her wing. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. "Valkyrie, you got the high six." Ripper's voice crackled over the comms, assigning her the rearguard position. He called her by her official call sign, but the condescension was baked in. "Valkyrie, a name for a warrior goddess, wasted on a paper pusher, copy that." Ripper, Kellen's voice, returned, calm as a lake. "Valkyrie is on station." The four jets climbed into the vast, empty sky, a perfect formation against the blue. Below, the Nevada desert sprawled out, indifferent. For Ripper, this was the overture to his symphony of dominance. For Kaylin, it was just another Tuesday. The initial calm of the patrol was a deliberate deception. The architects of Operation Cerberus were fond of sudden, jarring escalations. 30 minutes into their flight, the AWACS controller's voice sliced through the quiet. "Viper flight, multiple bandits, bearing 270 for 150 fast movers. Looks like the aggressor squadron decided to crash the party early." Ripper's grin was predatory. The 64th Aggressor Squadron, the professional bad guys, flying F-16s painted in Russian camouflage patterns, their pilots the best dogfighters in the world. This was the test he craved. "I've got M on the scope," Ripper announced, his voice electric with adrenaline. "Rogers, engage. Valkyrie, you and Echo hold back. Keep your eyes peeled and try to stay out of the furball." The order was a calculated insult, dismissing her as a non-combatant. He was telling her to watch the real pilots work. "Copy," Kaylin replied, her tone unchanged. There was no hint of frustration, no bruised ego, just acceptance. It was this placid demeanor that irritated Ripper the most. It was unnatural. He and his wingman, Psycho, broke formation, their Super Hornets streaking towards the enemy contacts. In the command center, the exercise director, a grizzled Air Force general named McCabe, watched the main screen. He saw Ripper's aggressive move and shook his head slightly. He then zoomed in on the two trailing icons, Valkyrie and Echo. He keyed his mic to a private channel. "Major Rostova, this is Cerberus actual status." "Green, General," Kellen's voice came back, for his ears only watching the kids play. McCabe's eyes drifted to the personnel file on his tablet. He paused on a heavily redacted section, then looked at the strange silver feather patch shown in her official photo. "Let me know if they need a babysitter," he said, a weary resignation in his voice. "Will do," she replied. Back in the sky, Ripper was a shark in a frenzy. He charged headlong at the four aggressor F-16s, underestimating their skill. The aggressors weren't interested in a head joust. They split, to dropping low into the desert clutter, to climbing into the sun. It was a classic bracket, and Ripper had flown right into the middle of it. "Ripper, you've got 2 on your 6. Hi, Kellen's voice cut in. A calm statement of fact. They're in the sun, I see. Valkyrie, Ripper snapped back, annoyed at the backseat driving, but he didn't see them, not really. A moment later, the piercing tone of a missile lock screamed in his cockpit. Fox 2. Fox 2. An aggressor pilot called out gleefully. Ripper's screen flashed. Red. Simulated hit. His Super Hornet was, for the purposes of the game, a multi-million-dollar lawn dart. Silence descended on the command frequency. The only sound was the faint hiss of static and the ragged breathing of Ripper's wingman. Ripper's hit. I'm defensive, Psycho yelled, his jet already twisting in a desperate attempt to evade the second F-16. But the aggressors were masters of this game. They worked in perfect, predatory harmony. Psycho evaded the first missile but flew directly into the path of the second aggressor. Another simulated kill. Two of the Navy's finest, gone in less than 30 seconds. The remaining two aggressors, their job done, turned their attention to the two jets that had been held in reserve. Debate. Valkyrie, we've got company. Echo's voice was tight with anxiety. He was fresh out of training, and his first major exercise had just turned into a 2v4 scenario, where his flight lead was a pilot everyone called a glorified secretary. On the screen in the command center, the four red icons of the aggressor squadron began to converge on the two blue icons of Valkyrie and Echo. It was a feeding frenzy. The aggressor lead, a pilot with the call sign Wraith, keyed his mic. Well, looks like we've got the old folks home and the daycare center left. Let's wrap this up, boys. The mockery was broadcast for everyone to hear. In his dead cockpit, Ripper listened, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He had been arrogant, and he had been swatted from the sky like a fly. Now he had to listen as his squadron mates were about to be picked apart. He expected Kalen to order a retreat. The logical move was to turn tail and run, push the throttles to the far wall and hope to outrun them to the exercise boundary. It would be a failure, but a predictable one. No one would blame the desk pilot for not wanting to engage four of the world's best aggressors, but the order to run never came. Instead, Kellen's voice, impossibly calm, came over the radio. Echo, form on me. Tighten it up, ma'am. Echo stammered. There's four of them. I can count. Echo, she replied, and for the first time there was a hint of something other than placid calm in her voice. It was a cold, hard edge, like chipped flint. Match my vector and power setting. Disengage your flight lip. A collective pause rippled through everyone on the frequency. Disengaging the limiters on an F-15 was not standard procedure. It allowed for maneuvers that put immense stress on the airframe, maneuvers that could, if done incorrectly, tear the wings right off. It was a move for a desperate, last-ditch fight. Kalen Rostova, the quiet librarian, was preparing for exactly that. The mystery of the pilot was about to be eclipsed by the mystery of her skill. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The F-15C that had been flying with quiet, reserved grace suddenly came alive. Kalen didn't jam the throttle or pull a high G-turn. Instead, she made a subtle, almost imperceptible adjustment, nosing the jet slightly down to build speed, then pulling into a gentle climb that seemed to be taking her away from the fight. The aggressors, seeing this, moved to cut her off, assuming she was making a panicked, clumsy attempt to flee. She's running scared. Wraith's voice dripped with contempt. Box her in. But she wasn't running, she was positioning. Kalen was using the geometry of the sky, placing herself at a precise altitude and angle relative to the sun. Echo, stay glued to me, she commanded. When I call break, you go low. Got it? Yes, ma'am. Echo's voice was a squeak. As the first two F-16s closed in, Kalen did something that made no sense. She rolled her eagle inverted and pulled back on the stick, entering a split S maneuver, a basic aerobatic move, but the timing was exquisite. For a split second, as she dove, her aircraft was perfectly silhouetted against the blinding glare of the Nevada sun. The aggressors, looking up, were momentarily blinded. It was only for a second, but in a dogfight, a second is an eternity. Break, Echo now, Kalen yelled. Echo dove as instructed. The aggressors, recovering their vision, saw the rookie, running, and two of them gave chase, falling for the classic bait. The other two, including Wraith, stayed on Kalen, but she was already gone, diving towards the desert floor at supersonic speed. She wasn't running from them. She had been running towards the two aggressors who had dropped low earlier to ambush Ripper. They were now climbing back up, thinking the fight was over, and flew directly into her path. They never even saw her. Coming, Valkyrie Fox 2, she said, her voice as level as a surgeon's. A simulated missile streaked from her wing. The tone of a successful lock echoed over the net. One of the climbing F-16s vanished from the radar screens in the command center. Simulated hit. The remaining aggressor pilot, stunned, broke hard, trying to locate the threat. He was met with the sight of an F-15C climbing vertically, seeming to hang in the air for a moment, before nosing over and pointing its cannon directly at him. Guns, guns, guns. Kellen's voice was a low growl. A simulated cannon kill in the span of 15 seconds. The quiet desk jockey had changed the odds from 4v-2 to 2v2. A stunned silence fell over the radio. Ripper, floating in his metaphorical parachute, felt a cold dread mix with a dawning unbelievable respect. He hadn't just misjudged her, he had been blind. Wraith was furious. He had been played. The old woman in the relic jet had used the sun, the sky, and his own team's arrogance against them. He watched the icons for two of his pilots blink out on his display, replaced by the cold, digital text of a kill confirmation. This was no longer a simple cleanup operation. This was a fight. 3 and 4, re-engage. Wraith ordered. His remaining wingman, forget the rookie. All weapons on the Eagle. The two F-16s that had been chasing Echo abandoned their pursuit and climbed, turning back to join the fray. Echo, his heart hammering against his ribs, found himself suddenly alone. Ma'am, what are your orders? He asked, his voice shaking. Your job is to survive. Echo. Kellen's voice came back, steady as a rock. Stay low. Use the terrain. Make them work to find you. I'll handle our friends. Handle them. 2 against 1. It was suicide. But Echo did as he was told, dropping his F-15 into the labyrinth of canyons and ridges below. The radar-absorbent rock offering a sliver of protection. Above, Kalen was a ghost. She wasn't engaging in a turning fight, a high-G battle of attrition that the smaller, more nimble F-16s would surely win. She was fighting with energy. She kept her F-15 at the edge of its performance envelope, using its powerful engines to climb and dive, converting altitude into speed and back again. She refused to be drawn into their fight, forcing them to play her game. It was a style of flying that was brutally efficient and deeply unsettling to watch. There was no wasted movement, no flair. It was the cold, calculated physics of death. Wraith and his wingman tried to bracket her again, one high, one low. It was a sound tactic, but Kalen seemed to anticipate it before it even developed. As they moved to set the trap, she cut her throttle, deployed her air brake, and forced an overshoot as Wraith's F-16 screamed past her. She was already rolling onto his 6, her radar locking on with a hungry shriek. Wraith, defensive. His wingman screamed. Wraith pulled a gut-wrenching turn, dumping flares, but it was too late. Kalen hadn't fired a missile. She was conserving them. She was closing in for another gun kill, a final act of dominance. On the private channel, General McCabe leaned into his mic. Valkyrie, what the hell are they teaching at Air Command and Staff College these days? He asked, a note of genuine shock in his voice. Kalen, in the middle of the most intense dogfight of the exercise, took a fraction of a second to reply. The same thing they always have. Sir, she said, her breathing even. Patience. The duel between Valkyrie and Wraith became the focal point of the entire exercise. Every pilot, both dead and alive, was glued to the comms. The controllers in the command center abandoned their other screens. This was a masterclass. Wraith was a phenomenal pilot, a Top Gun instructor known for his aggressive, almost clairvoyant instincts. He threw his F-16 around the sky, pushing it to the absolute limits of its capabilities, trying to force Kalen into a mistake. But Kalen didn't make mistakes. She was a wall. She met his every move not with a countermove, but with a preemptive shift that rendered his attack useless. It was like watching a grandmaster play chess, thinking 10 moves ahead. Wraith would try to drag her into a slow-speed turning fight, and she would extend using her F-15's superior power to climb away, resetting the engagement on her own terms. He would dive, trying to lose her in the ground clutter, and she would be waiting for him when he came back up, having used the dive to reposition herself at a higher energy state. The radio chatter was sparse, a staccato of tactical louse. Wraith, engaged, defensive. Valkyrie press. He's trying to bleed your energy. Valkyrie, don't follow him down. That last one was from Ripper, unable to stay silent, his voice a mix of awe and warning. Kalen didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what Wraith was doing. Shores letting him burn fuel and energy, letting him throw his best moves at her, all while she made small precise adjustments, conserving her own strength. It was a war of attrition, not of airframes, but of wills. Wraith was an artist, painting the sky with violent, beautiful maneuvers. Kalen was a physicist, exploiting the laws of motion and energy with ruthless precision. Finally Wraith saw an opening. Kalen had extended a bit too far. He cut across the circle, a perfect lag pursuit maneuver, hoping to get a missile shot off as she completed her turn. His radar began to search, to lock. Got you now, he muttered, his thumb hovering over the weapon's release button, but as his nose came around, she wasn't there. Kalen had done the one thing he didn't expect. She had cut her engines to idle and deployed her massive air brake, a piece of equipment the size of a barn door. Her F-15, which had been traveling at nearly the speed of sound, decelerated so violently that Wraith's F-16 shot past her like a freight train. In the blink of an eye, the hunter had become the hunted. Kalen's nose was now 6 feet from his tailpipe. She didn't need a missile, Wraith, she said, her voice calm and clear over the radio. A final, simple epitaph: checkmate. A simulated cannon burst, so close it would have shattered his canopy, ended the fight. The kill notification flashed on Wraith's screen. He slumped in his seat, not angry, but utterly, completely defeated. He had flown a perfect fight, and he had been systematically dismantled by a pilot who seemed to operate on a different plane of existence. The last aggressor, who had been trying to get a lock on Kalen from a distance, saw his leader fall and knew the game was up. Viper flight is RTB, he announced, his voice flat. The exercise was over. Valkyrie and Echo were the sole survivors. The frequency was dead silent. No one knew what to say. The cocky young guns of the Jolly Rogers had been annihilated. The legendary aggressors had been humbled. And it had all been done by one woman in an old jet. A woman they had dismissed as a relic. When Kalen's F-15 taxied back to the flight line, the ground crew stared. They had heard the radio chatter. They knew what had happened. As she shut down her engines and the canopy hissed open, a strange quiet fell over the normally bustling tarmac. Kalen went through her post-flight checks with the same unhurried calm she'd displayed all day. She climbed down the ladder, her helmet under her arm, her expression unreadable. The first person to approach her was Ripper. He had been waiting by her parking spot, his own helmet in his hands. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a raw, confusing mix of shame and profound respect. He looked at her, at the quiet, middle-aged woman who had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about air combat. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? Sorry for calling you a desk jockey. Thanks for showing me what a real pilot looks like. Instead, his eyes fell to the patch on her shoulder, the black circle, the single silver feather. It seemed to hold a different weight now. It wasn't a vanity patch. It was a warning. Where? Ripper finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Where did you learn to fly like that? Kalen looked at him, her gaze steady. She didn't answer his question directly. She simply reached up and tapped the silver feather with 2 fingers. A long time ago, she said, her voice soft. In a place where patience was the only thing that kept you alive. She then walked past him towards the debriefing room, leaving him standing alone on the hot tarmac, the silence of the sky still ringing in his ears. The debriefing room was a tomb. The flight data played on the main screen, a silent ballet of icons and vectors that confirmed the unbelievable truth. Kalen sat in the back, sipping from a bottle of water, while the squadron's commander tried to find words to describe the utter demolition they had just witnessed. Ripper and the other pilots just stared, their faces pale. After the debrief, General McCabe's aide found Kalen. The general would like to see you, Major. His office. Kalen nodded and followed the aide to the command building. McCabe's office was sparse and functional, the walls adorned with maps and photos of aircraft. He was standing by the window, looking out at the flight line. He didn't turn when she entered. I haven't seen flying like that since the Zulfikar Pass incident, McCabe said, his voice low. You flew with Colonel St. Michael's, didn't you? Kalen stood at ease. Yes, sir. Saint was my commander. McCabe finally turned, his eyes locking on her. They were old eyes, full of ghosts. He taught you that air brake maneuver, called it hitting the wall, said it was a stupid, suicidal move that worked exactly once. It worked today, Kalen replied quietly. The general walked to his desk and sat down heavily. He gestured for her to take the seat opposite him. He pointed a thick finger at the patch on her shoulder. Project Chimera, he said. It wasn't a question. I thought they decommissioned you people. Thought you were all ghosts. Most of us are, sir, Kalen said, her face betraying no emotion. The name hung in the air between them. Project Chimera. It was a unit that existed only in whispers and heavily redacted after-action reports. They weren't a fighter squadron, they weren't bombers. They were officially designated as a Special Operations Aviation Detachment. In reality, they were the military's most elite and deniable problem solvers. Their mission was retrieval and denial. When a stealth drone went down deep in enemy territory, Chimera went in to get the data core. When a friendly spy's cover was blown, Chimera was the hand that plucked them from a rooftop in the dead of night. They flew modified, unmarked aircraft, often alone, always without support. Their dogfights weren't the clean high-altitude duels of exercises like Cerberus. They were desperate, knife-in-a-phone booth brawls at treetop level, with the sole purpose of surviving long enough to complete the mission. The Silver Feather, McCabe said, his voice softer now. That was for the Alcut mission, wasn't it? For getting Ambassador Thorne's son out. Kellen's mask finally cracked. A flicker of pain, deep and old, crossed her face. Yes, Sir Jock Thorne, McCabe said, connecting the dots. Ripper. Does he know you're the one who saved his father? No, sir, Kalen said, and with all due respect, I'd prefer to keep it that way. Just as General McCabe was about to press her further, the secure line on his desk chirped a piercing, insistent sound that cut through the quiet tension in the room. He snatched the receiver. McCabe. He listened, his face growing grimmer with each passing second. His eyes, which had been focused on the past, were now sharp, locked onto the present crisis. He scribbled notes on a pad, his handwriting sharp and angry. Understood, he said finally, and hung up. He looked at Kalen, his expression hard as granite. That was CENTCOM. We have a real-world situation. An RQ-180 surveillance drone went down about an hour ago, right on the border of the Terek Valley. Kellen's blood ran cold. The Terek Valley was a hornet's nest, a contested, mountainous region controlled by a loose coalition of well-armed insurgents, tacitly supported by the neighboring country. It was a no-go zone for conventional forces. The drone's data core has our entire intelligence network for the region on it, McCabe continued, his voice low and urgent. Losing it is not an option. A SEAL team was sent in via Halo Jump to secure the crash site and retrieve the core. They've found the wreckage, but they're pinned down, taking heavy fire from multiple well-fortified positions. He stood and walked to a large digital map on the wall, bringing up the topography of the Terek Valley. It was a jagged scar of rock and shadow. Red icons pulsed around a single blue one. The SEALs. The enemy knows what they're looking for. They're throwing everything they have at our boys. Kalen stood and joined him at the map, her mind already processing the tactical problem. The steep canyon walls, the limited lines of sight, the entrenched enemy positions. It was a death trap. What's the air support situation? She asked. McCabe pointed to a swirling mass of green and yellow on the weather overlay, moving in rapidly from the west. There is no air support. A massive storm front is rolling in. The ceiling is dropping to near zero. Nothing can get in or out. Not a helicopter, not a standard strike fighter. We have a 30-minute window before that valley is completely socked in for at least 12 hours. The SEALs won't last that long. He zoomed in on the blue icon. It was flashing, a silent plea for help in a sea of red. The mission was impossible. A ground-based rescue was out of the question. Air support was grounded. The SEALs were on their own, about to be overrun, and with them, a treasure trove of national secrets. The room was silent. The only sound, the quiet hum of the electronics. It was a problem with no solution. A checkmate scenario. General McCabe stared at the map, the pulsing red icons like a cancer spreading across the valley. He ran a hand over his tired face, the weight of the men on the ground pressing down on him. Every conventional option was a dead end. Every protocol, every standard operating procedure led to the same conclusion: mission failure, loss of the asset, and the almost certain death of the SEAL team. His gaze drifted from the map to the woman standing beside him. He looked at her calm, focused expression, the way her eyes traced the canyon contours, not with despair, but with a cold, analytical assessment. He saw the quiet competence that had been invisible to everyone else just hours before. And he saw the silver feather on her shoulder, the symbol of an impossible extraction, a promise kept against all odds. He looked back at the map, at the storm front, the entrenched enemy, the sheer cliffs, the impossible terrain, the impossible timeline, the impossible odds. This is a Chimera mission, he said. The words were quiet, a statement of fact, not a question. He was acknowledging a truth that existed outside the normal bounds of military doctrine. This wasn't a problem for a fighter wing or a bomber squadron. This was a problem for a ghost. Kellen's eyes didn't leave the map. She traced a potential ingress route with her finger, a suicidal path that snaked through the lowest point of the valley, a place where the radar would be useless and the turbulence would be catastrophic. The storm offers cover, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. The low ceiling will negate their surface-to-air missile threat. The turbulence will be severe, but manageable. Manageable? McCabe's voice was incredulous. It would tear a Super Hornet apart. An F-15 is built differently, Kalen stated simply. It has a higher thrust-to-weight ratio, more stable in a low-speed, high-alpha environment. It can handle it. She was talking about her aircraft as if it were a living thing, an old, trusted partner whose limits and strengths she knew intimately. She saw the problem not as a barrier, but as a set of conditions to be exploited. The storm wasn't an obstacle, it was camouflage. The canyon wasn't a death trap, it was a shield. She was thinking like a Chimera operator again. The years she had spent behind a desk, flying simulators and pushing papers, fell away. The muscle memory, the cold, hard calculus of survival and mission success, came flooding back. She looked at McCabe, her eyes clear and direct. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice resonating with an authority that had been dormant for years. "It is." The exercise was over. The real war, the one she had tried to leave behind, had just found her again. The atmosphere in the briefing room had changed. The casual arrogance was gone, replaced by a tense, nervous energy. The mission was real, the stakes absolute. General McCabe laid out the situation, his voice grim. When he finished, he looked directly at Kalen. "Major Rostova will be mission commander. She will have her choice of aircraft and wingman. This is her operation." All eyes turned to Kalen. The woman they had mocked was now their only hope. She stood before the tactical map, her posture straight, her presence filling the room. She was no longer Kalen the desk jockey. She was Valkyrie, the mission commander. "I'll take my Eagle," she said without hesitation. "I need a wingman who can handle low altitude, high-stress flying and, most importantly, who will follow my instructions to the letter." A dozen pilots straightened up, eager to be chosen, to be part of the legend that was unfolding before them. But Kellen's eyes scanned the room and settled on one person, Jock's Ripper Thorne. Ripper flinched, certain she was about to humiliate him, to pass him over for someone more reliable. "He deserved it, Ripper," she said, her voice even. "You're with me." A stunned silence filled the room. She had chosen the pilot who had shown her the most disrespect, the one who had been the first to be killed in the exercise. Ripper couldn't believe it. "Ma'am," he stammered. "You were arrogant," Kalen said, her gaze pinning him in place. "But you weren't scared. You charged in. That was foolish. But today, foolishness and courage are going to look very similar. I don't need an ace. I need a pilot who has learned the cost of ego and is ready to listen." "Are you ready to listen, Lieutenant Commander?" Ripper stood up, his back ramrod straight. The humiliation he had felt on the flight line was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning desire for redemption. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Good," Kalen said, turning back to the map. "Then let's get to work." Her briefing was a model of terrifying efficiency. She laid out the plan, her words precise, her logic unassailable. They would fly under the storm. They would use the Terek Valley's narrowest canyon as their highway, flying below radar, below the enemy's missile engagement envelope. They would be invisible to everyone but the rocks. "We'll be in and out in 6 minutes, she concluded. "We provide close air support for the SEALs to extract the core, then we escort them out." Any questions? There were none. The plan was simultaneously brilliant and suicidal. It was a chimera plan. As they walked to their jets, Ripper fell into step beside her. "Ma'am, why me?" "Because," Kalen said, not looking at him, "you're the son of a man I once pulled out of a similar fire. I figure it runs in the family." She left him standing there, speechless, as she climbed into the cockpit of her F-15, the silver feather on her shoulder a silent testament to a promise she was about to make again. The flight to the Terek Valley was a descent into chaos. As they approached the storm front, the sky turned from a placid blue to a bruised, churning gray. The two jets, Kellen's F-15 and Ripper's F-A-18, flew into the wall of weather, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and rain. The turbulence hit them like a physical blow. Ripper's Super Hornet, designed for carrier landings and high-altitude performance, was being battered, tossed around the sky like a leaf. Alarms screamed in his cockpit, proximity warnings, wind shear alerts. He fought the controls, his knuckles white, his teeth clenched. "Valkyrie, I can't maintain stability," he yelled over the intercom, his voice strained. "The airframe is taking a beating." "Breathe, Ripper," Kellen's voice came back, a pillar of calm in the hurricane. "Don't fight it. Feel the air, let the jet move. Just keep her pointed forward. I've got you." He looked out his canopy and could just make out her F-15, a gray shadow against a gray background, flying with an impossible steadiness. She was one with the storm, riding its currents instead of fighting them. They dropped lower into the mouth of the canyon. Now the danger was twofold. The storm above and the granite walls on either side, so close he felt he could reach out and touch them. The rain came in sheets, lashing against the canopy, reducing visibility to almost zero. They were flying on instruments and instinct alone. Altitude 200 feet, Kellen's voice narrated, a steady rhythm. Airspeed 350. Watch the shear off the starboard ridge. It'll try to push you into the wall. Ripper felt the push she described and corrected his heart in his throat. This wasn't flying, this was controlled falling. It was a level of raw, visceral, seat-of-your-pants aviation that the Navy hadn't taught him. This was a skill learned in a different, harder school. He was beginning to understand. The mockery he and his squadron had heaped on her felt like a distant, childish memory. They had called her a desk jockey, a relic. They had been fools. They were pilots who flew jets. Kalen Rostova was something else entirely. She was a warrior, who wore a jet like a suit of armor. In this place of rock and storm, she was in her natural element. The sky wasn't her ceiling, it was her weapon. The terrain wasn't an obstacle, it was her shield. Ripper finally understood the source of her unnerving calm. It wasn't apathy or detachment. It was absolute, total mastery of her environment. She had been in hell before, and this was just another Tuesday. The violent shudder of the airframe, the scream of the wind, the claustrophobic proximity of the canyon walls, it all threw Kalen back in time. The desert air had been scorching, hot. Not cold and wet, but the feeling was the same. The feeling of being trapped in a granite coffin at 500 knots. Alcut Province a decade ago. She had been younger then, her call sign still new. She was flying a heavily modified F-111 Aardvark. Its wings swept back for a low-level dash. It was her first real Chimera mission. They had gone in to extract a CIA asset, the son of a prominent diplomat who had been captured by insurgents. The mission had gone sideways from the start. Their intelligence was bad. The asset wasn't in a safe house. He was in a fortified bunker. Her flight lead, her mentor, Colonel St. Michael's, had been shot down on the first pass. Kalen was alone, deep in enemy territory, with a downed pilot to rescue and an asset to extract. The sky was thick with anti-aircraft fire. She remembered the metallic taste of fear, the cold sweat trickling down her back. She remembered Saint's voice on the radio.com, even as his aircraft burned. Finish the mission, Valkyrie. Get the package, don't worry about me. The call sign had been his idea. You're the one who has to choose, he'd told her during training. You choose who lives, who dies, who comes home. You're the Valkyrie in that moment. She had hated the name. She made her choice. She located the bunker, a brutal low-level pass with cannons blazing to suppress the enemy, giving the asset the seconds he needed to break for the designated extraction point. Then she had circled back for Sant, her fuel gauge screaming at her, landing her Aardvark on a stretch of desert highway under heavy fire, a maneuver no one had ever trained for. She had gotten them both out. The young CIA asset, terrified but alive, was named Alex Thorne, Jox Thorne's father. For that mission, she had been awarded the first Silver Feather, a custom decoration for Chimera operators who successfully completed a mission against impossible odds after the loss of their unit support. It was a mark of honor, but to it felt like a scar, a reminder of the choice she'd had to make, the friend she'd almost left behind. Valkyrie 5 miles to target. Ripper's voice jolted her back to the present. She shook the memory away. This was not then, this was now. But the ghosts of the Alcut Canyons were flying with her in the Terrick Valley. They were a part of her, a part of the cold, hard skill that was now keeping to pilots and a team of SEALs. Alive, they burst out of the narrowest part of the canyon into a wider, bowl-shaped valley. Below them was a scene of chaos. The wreckage of the RQ-180 drone was a black smear against the rocky ground. Huddled behind a rock outcropping was the SEAL team, laying down a desperate field of fire against multiple enemy positions dug into the surrounding cliffs. Tracers, red and green, stitched the air. SEAL team, this is Valkyrie flight. Kellen's voice was crisp and authoritative over the Universal Guard frequency. We are on station. Mark your friendlies. A plume of purple smoke erupted. From the SEAL's position, Valkyrie, this is Trident lead. A strained voice crackled back. Glad to see you. We've got enemy armor on the east ridge. Multiple RPG nests in the cliffs at our 10 and 2 o'clock. We can't move. Copy that. Trident lead, Kalen said. Ripper, you take the armor. I'll take the nests. Guns only. Keep it clean. This was not the sanitized high-altitude combat of modern warfare. This was close air support at its most intimate and deadly. Kaylin rolled her F-15 onto its side, pulling it into a tight descending spiral. She was using the terrain again, coming at the RPG nests from an angle they would never expect. Using a blind spot created by a massive rock spire, she ignored the alarms screaming in her cockpit. She was flying by sight, by feel. Her eyes scanned the cliff face, picking out the muzzle flashes. She saw them, 3 of them. Her thumb squeezed the trigger on her control stick. The F-15's 20mm Vulcan cannon erupted with a sound like tearing linen. A brutal, visceral roar that echoed through the valley. A stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds, firing at a rate of 100 per second, slammed into the cliff face. Rock and earth vaporized. The RPG nests vanished. Ripper, following her lead, dove on the eastern ridge. He saw the enemy vehicle, a repurposed armored personnel carrier spitting heavy machine gun fire at the SEALs. He lined it up in his sights, his mind suddenly clear, his fear replaced by a cold, focused rage. He had a job to do. He was a wingman. He fired a burst from his own cannon, and the vehicle erupted in a ball of flame. Good hit, Ripper. Kellen's voice affirmed. Trident lead. You have a window. Move now. The SEALs broke cover, grabbing the hardened case containing the drone's data core and sprinting for the designated extraction point on the valley floor. Kalen and Ripper circled above them like guardian angels, their jets a terrifying presence that momentarily suppressed the enemy fire. They were a shield of steel and fire, buying the soldiers seconds with their own lives. The enemy was stunned, but not broken. As the SEALs scrambled down the scree slope, a new threat emerged. A volley of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. Manpads streaked up from a hidden position. Missiles. Missiles in the air, Ripper yelled, his instincts taking over. He and Kalen broke hard, dumping flares, their jets jinking violently to evade the heat-seeking projectiles. The missiles, confused by the flares and the extreme ground clutter, lost their lock and slammed harmlessly into the canyon walls. But the attack had been a diversion. As they evaded, a heavy anti-aircraft cannon, hidden in a cave, opened up. A stream of explosive shells filled the air around Ripper's Super Hornet. He felt a series of heavy thuds, a violent shudder that shook the entire airframe. I'm hit, he screamed. Right engine is on fire. Warning lights flashed across his console. The right engine temperature was redlining, the oil pressure dropping to 0. He was losing power, fast. Shut down the right engine, Ripper. Kellen's voice was sharp, cutting through his panic. Activate the fire extinguisher. Talk to me. What's your status? Engine is out, Ripper reported, his hands flying across the controls, performing the emergency procedures he had drilled 1,000 times but never imagined using. I've got a hydraulic failure warning. Flight controls are sluggish. He was flying a crippled bird, in the heart of a battle zone, miles from friendly territory. This was a death sentence. But his fear was secondary to a new, unfamiliar feeling. He had drawn their fire. His strafing run on the armor had made him the primary target, and in doing so, he had kept that heavy cannon from firing on Kalen or the evacuating SEALs. He had done his job. He had protected his lead. Trident lead. We have to get out of here now. Kellen's voice was urgent. My wingman is hit. We are Winchester on flares and going defensive. We're at the LZ. Lee, the SEAL leader, responded. Pop smoke. A plume of green smoke rose from the valley floor. The extraction was ready, but now Kalen had an impossible choice. The mission was to provide air cover for the SEALs, but her duty was also to her wingman. She couldn't leave Ripper behind, a crippled duck waiting to be shot down. For a fleeting second, Ripper saw the terrible calculus of command in his mind. He knew what the book said. A single damaged fighter was an acceptable loss to ensure the success of a critical mission and the safety of a dozen special forces operators. He keyed his mic, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Valkyrie, get them out. Don't worry about me. The request hung in the air, a final, selfless plea. Don't worry about me. The words echoed across time, pulling Kalen back to another impossible choice, another pilot's voice crackling over a dying radio. Finish the mission, Valkyrie. Get the package. That day in Alcut, she had been forced to choose between her mentor, Saint, and the mission objective, Alex Thorne. She had followed orders. She had secured the package first, leaving Saint to fend for himself until she could circle back. She had completed the mission, and she had rescued her friend. She had done both, but the cost had been a piece of her soul. She had lived with the agonizing minutes of uncertainty, the gut-wrenching fear that she would be too late to save him. The silver feather wasn't just a symbol of her success. It was a reminder of the razor's edge she had walked, the coin toss that had determined who lived and who died. After that mission, something inside her had broken. The burden of the choice, the weight of the call sign, became too much to bear. She had grounded herself, taking a desk job, an instructor position, anything to escape the cockpit where she was forced to be a goddess of death, a chooser of the slain. She had spent years building a wall around that memory, hiding behind the quiet, unassuming facade of a staff officer. She had convinced herself she was no longer that person. But the Terek Valley had torn that wall down. The storm, the rocks, the fire, it had all brought her back to who she truly was. She was a chimera, and chimeras left no one behind, not if they could help it. A cold, hard clarity washed over her. She would not make the same choice again. She would not leave a wingman to die while she saved the others. She would save them all. It was an insane, illogical, and deeply personal decision. It was not the choice a commander should make. It was the choice a Valkyrie had to. Negative, Ripper, she said, her voice ringing with an absolute authority that left no room for argument. We all go home, or none of us do. Stick with me. She keyed her mic to the SEAL's frequency. Trident lead, listen up. The extraction helicopter is not coming. The storm is too severe. I am your ride. A stunned silence came from the ground. Say again, Valky. I'm getting you out, she repeated. Get ready. Ripper watched in disbelief as Kellen's F-15, instead of climbing to safety, rolled and dove back towards the valley floor, aiming for the small, flat patch of ground where the SEALs were huddled. It was an act of tactical insanity that defied every rule of aviation, and it was the bravest thing he had ever seen. The enemy, seeing the crippled Super Hornet and the lone F-15, sensed victory. They began to advance, pouring fire, down into the valley, but their confidence was misplaced. They were not fighting a lone, desperate pilot. They were fighting a legend reawakened, a woman who was no longer bound by fear or convention. Kellen's F-15 became a scythe. She flew with a controlled fury, her every maneuver designed to inflict maximum damage while shielding the SEALs and her wounded wingmen. She used her last remaining missiles to take out the hidden anti-aircraft cannon, then went back to her guns, strafing enemy positions with a terrifying precision. She was everywhere at once, a grey ghost in the storm, her cannon fire the only thunder that mattered. Above her, Ripper wrestled with his damaged jet, fighting to keep it airborne. He couldn't fight, but he could be a target. He deliberately flew a predictable pattern, drawing fire, making himself an easy target to keep the enemy's attention off Kalen. It was the only thing he could do. He was no longer the arrogant ace, he was a shield for his lead. As Kalen completed her final gun run, a new threat appeared on her threat receiver. 2 enemy fighters, MiG-29s, were descending through the storm, vectored in by their ground control. They had found a hole in the weather. The hunters had become the hunted. Valkyrie bandits, 2 of them, on your 6, Ripper screamed. I see them, Ripper, she replied, her voice grim. Get out of here. Head for the border. That's an order. Not a chance, ma'am, Ripper shot back, his voice steady. I'm your wingman. Kalen didn't have time to argue. She pulled her F-15 into a gut-wrenching vertical climb, meeting the MiGs head-on. She was outnumbered, flying a heavier jet, and her fuel was critical. But she had the storm, and she had the ghosts of Alcat on her wing. This was no longer just about the SEALs or the data core. This was about redemption. She was no longer just saving the men on the ground. She was saving the pilot she used to be. She was a Valkyrie, a chooser of the slain. And she had decided that today, in this valley, no one else was going to die. She met the lead MiG in a head-on pass, firing her last missile. The MiG pilot, not expecting such a suicidally aggressive move, broke late. The missile found its mark, 1 down. But the second MiG was on her missile, already streaking from its wing. The dogfight was a brutal, close-quarters brawl in the heart of the storm. Kalen was fighting on pure instinct, her body and her machine moving as one. The remaining MiG pilot was good, and he was aggressive, sensing her vulnerability. He stuck to her 6, trying to get a clean shot, but Kalen used the terrain, diving back down into the canyon, forcing him to follow. The canyon walls streaked past in a grey blur. It was a deadly game of chicken, a test of nerve and skill. Kalen knew her F-15 couldn't outturn the more nimble MiG in this confined space. She had to change the rules of the fight. She flew towards a narrow fork in the canyon, a place she had noted on her ingress. At the last possible second, she rolled her jet 90 degrees, wings vertical, and sliced through the smaller opening, a gap barely wide enough for her wingspan. The MiG pilot, not expecting the maneuver, was forced to pull up, Losing his position, Kaylin had bought herself a few precious seconds, but the fight had dragged her farther away from Ripper. She looked at her radar and saw his icon, moving, slowly, painfully, towards the border, and behind him, unseen by Ripper, a third enemy fighter had appeared. A fresh contact dropping out of the storm, moving in for an easy kill on the crippled Super Hornet. Ripper, break rate. You've got a bandit on your 6. Low, she yelled, pushing her throttle to the firewall, trying to get back to him, but she was too far away. Ripper's damaged controls were too sluggish. He couldn't evade. I can't shake him, Valkyrie, he shouted, the sound of a missile lock tone screaming in the background of his transmission. Kaylin watched the radar display, a cold, sickening dread washing over her. A missile icon detached from the bandit and streaked towards Ripper's icon. It was a perfect shot. There was no escape. She was going to watch her wingman die. She was going to fail. The ghosts of her past rose up, whispering accusations in her ear. You choose who lives. You choose who dies. In that moment, something snapped. The cold, calculated precision of the Chimera operator gave way to the raw, protective instinct of a warrior. She was not going to let it happen. Not again. She pointed the nose of her F-15 at Ripper's position and did the one thing no sane pilot would ever do. She performed the maneuver St. Michael's had called hitting the wall. It wasn't in any flight manual. It was a move born of pure desperation, a tactic from the Chimera playbook for when all other options were gone. Kaylin cut her engine to idle, pulled the nose up to a ridiculously high angle of attack, and deployed her F-15. Traveling at nearly 600 miles per hour, decelerated with a violence that slammed her against her harness. The jet shuddered, groaning in protest, on the very edge of a catastrophic stall. She had turned her aircraft into a massive airborne shield. On his screen, the enemy pilot saw the missile tracking perfectly towards the crippled Super Hornet. It was a guaranteed kill. Then, something impossible happened. The lead aircraft, the F-15 he had been chasing, suddenly appeared between him and his target, seemingly materializing out of thin air. It was huge, stationary, a wall of metal in the sky. He had no time to react. Kaylin's jet absorbed the full force of the missile's proximity fuse. The warhead detonated just off her tail, sending a wave of shrapnel tearing through her fuselage. The cockpit screamed with a dozen new alarms. The right engine, which had performed so flawlessly, flamed out. The controls went dead for a terrifying second before the backup hydraulic systems kicked in. Her F-15 was mortally wounded, a falling, burning wreck, but it had worked. Ripper's Super Hornet, shielded by her sacrifice, flew on, untouched. The sky fell silent. The remaining enemy fighters, seeing the F-15 begin its uncontrolled descent, and having lost their primary target, broke off the engagement and fled. Kaylin fought the controls, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She managed to restart her damaged engine, its roar a painful, grinding protest. She had a single functioning engine, minimal flight controls, and an airframe that was threatening to disintegrate around her. Valkyrie, my God, what did you do? Ripper's voice was a choked whisper over the radio. He had seen it all. He had seen her place her own aircraft in the path of a missile meant for him. I kept a promise, Ripper, Kaylin breathed, her vision starting to blur at the edges. Now let's go home. Together the two crippled jets, one flown by a humbled ace, the other by a living legend, limped across the border, leaving the storm and the ghosts of the Terrick Valley behind them. The return to base was a silent affair. The emergency crews were waiting, their lights painting the rainy tarmac in strobing colors. Kaylin's F-15 was a wreck, riddled with holes, its right tail blackened and shredded. Ripper's Super Hornet wasn't much better. They landed, one after the other, their tires kissing the runway with the gentle touch of survivors. When Kaylin finally cut the power to her battered jet, the silence that followed was profound. She sat for a long moment in the cockpit, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She had faced her past, and, for the first time in a decade, she felt at peace. She climbed down the ladder, and the entire squadron was there, standing in the rain, waiting. The ground crews, the other pilots, even General McCabe. They didn't cheer, they just watched, their faces filled with a reverence that was more powerful than any applause. The SEAL team she had saved was there too. Their leader walked forward and stopped in front of her. He said nothing, simply handing her the hardened case containing the drone's data core. The mission was complete. Then Ripper approached. The arrogant swagger was gone forever, replaced by the quiet humility of a man who had been shown a truth greater than himself. He looked at her, at the lines of exhaustion on her face, and then his eyes fell to the patch on her shoulder. black circle, the single silver feather. It was no longer a mystery. It was her story. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of impossible choices, and of promises kept in the violent, lonely silence of the sky. Ripper didn't speak. Words were inadequate. Instead, he raised his hand to his brow and rendered the slowest, most precise, most respectful salute of his life. It was a gesture that acknowledged everything: her skill, her courage, his own foolishness, and the profound debt he now owed her. One by one, every other person on the flight line followed suit. A silent, solemn tribute to the quiet woman they had so badly misjudged. Kaylin Rostova, the desk jockey, the relic, looked at the sea of salutes, and for the first time that day, a faint, weary smile touched her lips. Her call sign had never been a boast. It had been a burden. But today, surrounded by the men and women she had fought for, it finally felt like what St. Michael's had always intended it to be: an honor.